first hearing of Amy Coney Barrett, who is the Supreme Court nominee sent down to Congress by Trump. And it kind of seems to me like there isn't really a clear line of attack that's kind of taking hold here. There's comments about sort of what she may do with Roe v. Wade. There's obviously a Democratic line that the Affordable Care Act may be imperiled if she's confirmed to the court. There's a much kind of larger liberal ecosystem of people looking at her past religious beliefs or her current religious beliefs, suggesting that she may try to impose religious beliefs on the public, the courts. But it seems like it's kind of a jumble to me. I don't get a clear sense of why Americans should oppose this beyond the process argument, which I think was very strong at first. That was what all Democrats were united in saying, was that we should wait until after the election. This is just like Merrick Garland. There's no right to appoint a judge. But actually, when Morning Consult polled about this, so on September 26, 2020, right after the death of Justice Ginsburg, only 37% of Americans said that they should vote to confirm. Scroll up to October 2nd, before they did a second round of polling, it went up to 46% of Americans said they should vote to confirm, 23% don't know, no opinion, 31% were against. So it seemed like the process argument kind of collapsed. People have moved past that one. So now they're looking for a substantive argument, and the substantive argument, I just don't see anything sticking so far.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, even before you get to the substantive argument, right? What message should they choose? What policies should they highlight? Is stopping a Supreme Court nominee even really a thing anymore, right? When was the last time it even happened? I mean, the last time in the past, let's say 3 decades, there's been maybe 2. There was Harriet Miers was the last one, right? The Bush.
Harriet
nominee.
Miers withdrew, and largely
Right.
the reason that happened was because she just didn't have any judicial experience, and conservatives themselves were like, "What is this? Who is?" We don't
And
know who this
that's
person
exactly
is.
right. That's exactly right. It wasn't really even, she wasn't even really stopped because of any sort of partisan action on the part of Democrats. It wasn't really opposition to her from, it's nothing that would actually translate to this, right? And so, I mean, the question is even if they had some kind of message, what was that? Would it even work? I mean, is there even a way to stop nominees anymore? And that's, from the very beginning of this whole thing, it just seems like there's this industry of people who feel the need, just because they're part of this activist media, progressive activist media complex, who sort of feel the need to just tell Democrats to fight on something, even though there was never really a path to stop this, right? I think there were, in the days of, maybe in the 80s and before that, the last one before Myers was Bork, right? He was the last one defeated. There was a time when in Congress you had this sort of middle where you could actually convince enough senators to oppose a nominee of his own party, right? That's just not something that really exists anymore.
Well, there were a couple. So I think Lisa Murkowski wasn't going to go ahead for the vote, and same thing with Susan Collins. I think they were both kind of doing the punting on the process part of it and saying, well, after the election, whoever's elected, we can take a look at, but the reason for that is because Susan Collins is in a competitive election, right, in Maine, and Lisa Murkowski will be in Alaska, which is in some ways trending more Democratic. So I think there are a few people who are in the electoral position to actually be in that case, but I think so far in the rest of the Senate, it's kind of filtered out in a way to where they don't feel that way. And it's interesting that even some of the senators that maybe would be threatened, like a David Perdue or a Kelly Loeffler in Georgia, neither of them have had any hesitancy either. So, and even some of the senators who are a little bit threatened aren't really willing to back off, it seems. And yeah, there is a remarkable amount of unanimity on this. I think that if you read a lot of the conservative publications that are sometimes critical of Trump, they're all united behind this. I haven't really seen much of anything from the Never Trumposphere or the people on the right who sometimes break with Trump. I think the Supreme Court has become something that is just ultra partisan at this point. and you're just not going to see Republicans in mass, except for the most examples where they're most threatened, like Susan Collins. I don't think you're going to see them back off on this nomination. And I also think part of that is what happened with Justice Kavanaugh, because I think a lot of conservatives felt that he was kind of done wrong, and I think a lot of Democrats felt that like Merrick Garland was done wrong. And so now it's become like locked in a complete partisan kind of loop. And I don't think we'll see any Democrats vote for Amy Coney Barrett, and I think it'd be very hard to see her lose enough votes of Republicans to not go through.
Yeah, it just seems to me like Supreme Court nominations now are just completely decided by power, right? Power and votes. Like if they have the votes, they go through, and if they don't, they don't. And it doesn't even matter, what you can dig up
Now,
on
remind
someone.
me when Obama nominated Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, I believe some Republicans did vote for them, right?
That's a good question. I don't actually remember how many, if there were crossovers and how many.
Certainly under George Bush, when he nominated like Alito, I think Democrats had a filibuster threat that kind of fell apart. So it really, maybe we could say this is the more recent development that it became this partisan to the level that it has been. I think over the past couple presidents before that, maybe it wasn't as divisive.
And it's funny you bring up Alito, because that's another reason why Harriet Miers really doesn't count as a defeat, because at the end of the day, what they got was someone even more conservative than Harriet Miers. That was part of why I think conservatives opposed Harriet Miers was, yes, she was unqualified, but I think she wasn't really a trusted movement conservative, in terms of like just legal jurisprudence in the way that Alito was. So, it really has been a long time since since Democrats or Republicans have defeated a nominee based on ideological opposition, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's a little bit of a shadow of that in terms of what happened with Kavanaugh, in that there was a chance that Kavanaugh would have been withdrawn by Trump. Trump chose to stand by him, but a lot of conservatives were pushing Trump to withdraw Kavanaugh and put in Amy Coney Barrett. Part of that is that they like her a lot more. They trust her. They followed her career. They think maybe she's more socially conservative. I think a lot of conservatives are worried that like their social conservative causes are not even doing that well under a conservative Supreme Court. So a couple recent examples of that would be that the Supreme Court ruled, including a Trump judge and also a Bush judge, that businesses can no longer fire like LGBT people based on their status. They also basically struck down some restrictions that Louisiana placed on abortion. Now, this was a conservative court. So I think a lot of conservatives kind of had their back up against the wall. They're saying, hey, look, we worked so hard for the Republicans. A lot of us don't even like Trump, but we voted for him so to get us these judges. And now you have this judge. And I think, whether you're on the business right or you're on the social right, you probably like her. I still think the social conservatives are not really going to have the upper hand even if she's confirmed, just because I don't think some of the other judges there really are that socially conservative. Like, I think Alito and Thomas, you could argue, are. I would say the rest, like Roberts is a real swing vote. I think even Kavanaugh's a swing vote, and Gorsuch is a swing vote in some regards. So I don't think you can
on social issues.
So I don't think you can necessarily trust any of them. But I think if you're the average conservative out there and you watch this process closely, and a lot of conservatives vote on the Supreme Court historically, like it's a big deal for them. For Amy Coney Barrett, I think they're thinking, okay, we got us another like Alito, another Scalia, who she was close to, or another Thomas, and that, to me, is kind of powering this through. And Democrats, like you say, are putting up a show of force here. The problem is I don't think they have a line that really sticks on her. And I think a lot of the Democrats kind of extra parliamentary kind of, the media and some lawmakers have made remarks and said things about like her family or her religious faith that I think are exaggerated or just, they're getting completely off tangent. And this is creating kind of even more of a backlash among conservatives to be even more steeled to support her, right? Like they haven't found the sort of things that would cause like a Harriet Miers moment, right? That would like cause something like a withdrawal. The kind of things they're finding are kind of stealing Republicans even more, making them hunker down even more. And they're the ones that have all the votes. The only way you would defeat her is if you could get like a Mitt Romney, or you could get a Cory Gardner or somebody to withdraw from supporting her, and that just hasn't been found yet.
Yeah, if we get past the fact that the national political conversation sort of is requiring us to sort of like suspend belief, right? And pretend that like these kinds of things can hang in the balance somehow, and that you can have some kind of forceful kind of rhetoric in these hearings, and have some kind of Q&A that just explodes a nominee. If we can kind of just accept that, get beyond that, yeah, I mean, my opinion is that the reason why they can't really find something that sticks or something that can kind of derail a nominee is because at the end of the day, like, you have to talk about things that people care about, right? And, when it comes to a Supreme Court nominee, the entire argument is that this person will threaten issues you care about, right? This person will threaten legislation. This person will threaten progress, especially if you're a Democrat, right? If you're coming from the progressive end of things and you're trying to convince people that this person is going to block what we want to do for the country, right? When was the last time Democrats did something huge, or not even huge, but like what are the things that Democrats can point to and say that this is something we did that they're going to erode? I mean, right now there's really just one thing. It's Obamacare, right? It's the ACA. Beyond that, it's Roe v. Wade. They can talk about Roe v. Wade. Those are the two things, and that's why those are the only two things you read about and hear about. But I don't know that that's really enough. I mean, Roe v. Wade is the perennial one, right? In terms of Obamacare, I mean, I don't know that, like, Obamacare is definitely a big deal for for partisans. It's definitely a big deal for Democrats who are proud of that accomplishment. It has a lot. I mean, it's in the name, Obamacare, right? It's very tied up with the last president, Barack Obama, right? And so there's a real, like, attachment to that, the progressive accomplishment of the Affordable Care Act, right? But at the end of the day, like, I don't know that a lot of people are really all that freaked out about what Amy Coney Barrett might do to Obamacare outside of maybe Democratic partisans. I mean, that only at best that convinces half of the country.
I think for one,
right, but like, that's not a crossover issue.
I mean, for one, I think it's kind of complicated what she could do with
right.
Obamacare. And that,
well, that's exactly.
If you read a lot of people, even on the conservative right, they say that it's unlikely that ACA would be struck down by adding her to the court. A lot of legal scholars find it to be pretty unlikely, and anything short of it being struck down altogether, it's like, what is the practical implication for me? What is the actual change to the law? The ACA is such a complicated law that I think some people don't even understand the implications of things when there are court decisions on it. So, for instance, like the Medicaid expansion, there was this historic ruling. Roberts was there ruling on the ACA, on the individual mandate, ruling that it was constitutional. In that very same ruling, they basically said, yeah, states don't have to take Medicaid if they don't want to. They don't have to expand. That part of the ruling barely made news. It had wide-ranging ramifications, but in a law that's kind of a Rube Goldberg machine of all these different moving parts, the Supreme Court doing something short of striking the whole thing down is not going to have immediate, glaring, obvious effects to a lot of people. It's hard to understand.
Right.
Which is why I think Roe v. Wade is the other issue that's being thrown out there, because it is kind of easy to understand in some ways. Like, the Supreme Court will say that states can ban abortion if they want to. That's very in your face. I find that to be fairly unlikely, even with her confirmed, just because of the way the current justices have been ruling on those issues. But I think it's easy to understand. So it's obviously an issue that can be thrown out there. Also, it's symmetrical, because a lot of people on the right want it to be overturned. A lot of people on the left don't want it to be overturned. So they can argue about that all day in easily understood terms. But a lot of the other stuff you can't. I mean, I don't think they've... ACB has such a long history of sort of being involved in kind of conservative judicial work and activism, but they just haven't found the case that kind of is emblematic of what her on the court looks like in a way that would scare enough voters in a place like Colorado or enough voters in a place like Georgia, where senators there would actually, I feel like, feel hesitant to support her. It's just become a straight, like, Roe v. Wade, half the country is this way, half the country is the other way, so there's really no benefit to sticking outside of your group. There's no benefit for the Republicans to diss their party and to strike her and to vote her down, with the one exception being someone like Susan Collins, who's in a fairly socially liberal state, I would say. That's what I would say Maine is, who I think the Roe v. Wade kind of threat would be a serious challenge for her. But elsewhere, it seems just a bit too going down normal partisan lines to be the thing.
Yeah, I mean, and if there was, like, again, if there was some kind of big expansion of the welfare state that took place in the last 4 years, 8 years, right? that the party and and the country in general was very invested in defending. I think that would be a big hook, right? But it's not really there. I mean, there's no, if we were in some kind of progressive New Deal era, right, where like a lot of legislation was being passed by Congress, by congressional Democrats, and things were, like there were new economic rights being afforded to citizens, and that was something that a conservative Supreme Court could stand and block. If the Supreme Court could be actually cast as an institution that's blockading like a new era of economic, equality in the country. But that's just not where we are. So I don't think there's no issue or legislation that I think Democrats can even point to. And that's sort of what kind of also points to this whole court packing debate as just a little bit unserious in a way, right? Like, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's like, okay, you want to pack the court, but like, why? What are you worried about right now, right? Like, why don't you pass some legislation first? Why don't you do things for the country first? I'm talking about Democrats here. Like, why don't you actually do things? And then if the court becomes a problem, then you have the political capital, right, to then take it to the American people, and you can say, look at these justices, look at this court, they are against you. We're passing these really popular things, and then
that's what Franklin Roosevelt kind of did, right? Like, there was a time when the Supreme Court was striking down New Deal era legislation, and so he composed a court packing plan. Eventually, there was a rebellion against the plan, didn't happen, but it did kind of send a signal to the court. And the court kind of didn't knock down as much of his legislation after that. But his entire thesis of this was, Americans love this stuff that we're doing. Like, they love the New Deal. The court's taking this thing down. They'll support me, or they'll at least understand what I'm trying to go for here by saying, I will add these justices. You're right. The only reason they're talking about adding justices is to kind of get back at the Republicans for Merrick Garland, right? And it's like...
Right, it's seen as purely like this partisan kind of payback kind of thing that like average voters just don't care about that sort of thing.
Well, average voters don't care about the Supreme Court at all right now, I think. Like, it's a very low priority for average voter. Most people can't name the justices. Most people couldn't name most of the prominent cases. And so, to make them care, you'd have to have something like what you're describing.
Right. Supreme Court is like this really elite, hyper-partisan debate right now because it's not about issues. It's about people. It's about like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? It's about these icons. It's about having the right people in the right chairs in high levels of government. It's not about actual issues. And that's why, going back to the original question of what we're talking about here, like that's why they can't actually find anything to really talk about that can move people, because it's an elite conversation. It's not an act. There's no hint of populism here. There's no hint of sort of, there's just nothing that can actually move people and sway them in terms of like what's in it for them. It's just a purely sort of aristocratic kind of conversation about like, how dare you like put the bad people in these chairs when we need the good people in these chairs. And it's like, well, what does that have to do with, what, people, affording their rent, affording healthcare?
I think so much of this is because so many people in politics are lawyers, and so like they have they're very, very knowledgeable about all this. Like, they know, like they can list like 50 cases off the top of their head, and like they build shrines to justices they like, whether it be Scalia on the right or it be Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the left. So I think this is a perfect moment for tons of people with law degrees to argue with each other. But it's just very hard to relate to the average person. And I'm not saying the average person shouldn't be concerned about it at all. It's just a fact of life that it's hard for people, absent something like the legislation you described in the moment that you described, making it kind of plain for people. So
yeah, I mean, it could be a big deal. I mean, it may very well be a big deal, but it's not yet there because no one's done anything to improve, the lives of people in the country, right? Congress isn't doing anything, hasn't done anything in a long time. One day we might get there, but until we do, I don't think anyone's going to care about the Supreme Court in the way that they need to block a nominee.
Hi, this is Zed. If you like our show, please help us keep it going by becoming a patron at patreon.com/thebackchannel. Thanks.